Hi guys, today I'm going to make a review of the book Circe by Madeline Miller because it really surpassed all of my expectations and I wanted to share my thoughts with you. Firstly, I want to talk about the cover of the book because it's so visually stunning. The dust jacket's lovely, and then underneath it has this lovely embossing on the cover and also on the spine, and then inside it has this gorgeous map of Aiaia where Circe lives. This book is by the author of the Song of Achilles, which is a myth retelling of Homer's Iliad, but this time from the perspective of Patroclus, Achilles' lover. And this book stays in the same vein of myth retellings, as Miller herself is a classicist, but this time it takes the story of Circe, a fairly minor character in Homer's Odyssey, who you might know from her encounters with him on his way back home to Ithaca, where he stays on her island for a year. This book does tell this element of Circe's story, but it emphasises the fact that it is only one element in what is an eternal life, and it really tells her story from her birth as the daughter of Helios and the nymph Perse, all the way through her various encounters that she has. Because all of the stuff in this book really derives from mythology, I'm not sure it's technically spoiling any of it to talk about the plot details, but as I was reading it there was so much that I knew absolutely nothing about, so I'm going to try and keep the plot details to the minimum in this review because I found it was actually really great to discover these things for the first time through reading this book. I had very little knowledge of Circe's story apart from really her encounter with Odysseus, so everything was new to me and I think it was done really well. I think the mythology, particularly Greek mythology, can be extremely complex. There's just so many different characters and extreme motivations for their actions, or some things seem quite illogical, so I think the biggest challenge for Miller was probably making a coherent story out of all these seemingly disparate elements and giving justification for the actions of people to make them seem more human rather than the immortal nymphs that they are. The narrative is quite unusual in structure because once Circe is exiled to the island of Aiaia, which happens quite early in her life, the plot then takes the form of a series of separate encounters she has with various characters who come to visit her island, and I think this would be very easy to seem disjointed, but one of the biggest I think successes of this book is that Miller succeeds in making all these different elements seem really connected. I imagine it was also quite tricky for Miller to create a narrative arc for a character who's immortal, because the events in this novel sometimes take place hundreds of years apart, so within this time frame it's quite tricky to have normal character development, but I think that Miller really succeeds in making this believable and having Circe genuinely develop as a character. I found it particularly interesting how this book deals with immortality. I can't really remember ever reading another book that has a protagonist who is immortal, and it gives a completely different texture to the story where the usual considerations of mortal human characters like staying alive and aging are no longer a consideration for Circe. It shows a perspective where to be immortal is the norm and to be mortal is actually the other, and I think this book spends a lot of time showing how Circe deals with her own immortality and the vast expanse of time that she has to do whatever she wants, and also how she has to come to terms with the fact she loves and cares for mortal humans who must die. I knew of course that Circe interacts with Odysseus in this novel and that he plays quite a big role in her life, but I really didn't realise the extent to which there were so many other mythological characters whose lives intersect with Circe's, and I'll just name a few of them to give you an idea of the scope of this novel. Of course Helios is a big part of it, Circe's dad, also Scylla and Charybdis, Hermes, Athena, Icarus, Daedalus, the Minotaur, Jason and Medea, Penelope. There are really so many different characters that crop up through the book. The reader often hears the wider stories of these characters beyond their direct interaction with Circe, and I found this a really good way to learn more about the mythologies of these different characters in a really accessible way. And in terms of Odysseus as well, we get to see an entirely new light on his character, completely different to that you see in the Odyssey. Without giving too much away about the plot, I think one of the big strengths in this book is how various characters throughout it have to come to terms with the fact that the stories they hear about heroic characters like Odysseus really don't match up to reality. Circe, in my understanding of her from Homer's Odyssey, is a witch and a seductress, which are neither very positive terms, and so I was kind of expecting her to be a nasty and spiteful character going into this book, but what Madeline Miller does is she looks at this myth through a revisionist feminist lens and allows Circe to be recast as a headstrong, empowered female. An issue that Miller is clearly interested in is that of witchcraft, and I think until fairly recent interpretations and reimaginings of witchcraft as a way to give power to women, such as in the books like His Dark Materials and Harry Potter, of course, and now so many more kind of feminist witchy books. The more traditional view of witchcraft was that of kind of hag-like woman. I think the classic example would be in Macbeth, the Weird Sisters, and they were always a threat to men of taking away their power, and often theorised as a threat of castration. This book recasts witchcraft as a skill that requires practice and precision, and it can be used to harm others, but is more generally used for much more benevolent purposes. Witchcraft was traditionally seen as quite unnatural, but this book makes it into the most natural thing in the world. It's really about Circe connecting with nature and harnessing its power. There's no cauldron stirring in this book. It's all about foraging and cutting up herbs and understanding seasonal cycles and a lot of patience. The history of powerful women in ancient literature was, of course, always written by men, so unsurprisingly there is a tendency to undermine any kind of power that they have. So it's actually really refreshing to see this kind of new take on powerful women. Circe's sexuality is also reconsidered in this book. I think a lot of the time she's seen as a sort of sexual predator, but in this view of it, she uses her sexuality freely, but not in a manipulative way. One of the most famous elements of Circe's myth is her turning men into pigs, and in this book it shows her doing so as an admonishment of sexual violence towards women rather than a kind of jealous rage that she's often depicted as having. It's much more of her inflicting a kind of moral justice on these men. I suppose there are those who will argue that Miller is just making this book into what she wants it to be, a feminist fable. But when it comes to mythology, there is no original canon, there's just various interpretations of old sources. And this is just seen as radically different because it is a woman who is kind of trying to question the patriarchal nature of most of these myth tellings. I had high hopes for this book because I recently read the Song of Achilles, and I was so impressed not only by the breadth and depth of the research that Miller clearly put into it, but also just the beauty of the writing itself, and Circe's exactly the same. I suppose I had a bit of a prejudice because Miller is a classicist and a teacher, and writing is kind of her second profession, so I thought it might be quite academic or detached or unemotional, but actually in both of her books she's written so far, the opposite is the case. They are really focused on interpersonal relationships. I think Miller is actually a really great writer, and Circe flows so well. There's great nuance given to Circe's thoughts and feelings and actions without it ever being pretentious. I would really recommend this to pretty much anyone. You don't have to have any prior knowledge of Greek mythology or even any real interest, because I can assure you this book will make you interested. Let me know what you thought of it if you've read it already. I really can't praise it highly enough. And I hope you enjoyed this video. I will see you really soon. Bye bye.